He speaks Icelandic, so yeah. Yeah, sjálfsagt. Good morning to all of you. Our second day on small states and the so-called European migration crisis. Great to see you here. Today we will be focusing on our upcoming book on the topic. We will start with the analytical framework of the book and some discussions on it. Then we will dig into some of the cases, focus on the administrative part of coping or the crisis, however we frame it. And in the end, we have a presentation on lessons to learn or theoretical lessons to learn from the cases presented in the book. But I would like to ask or invite the first speaker, Kuli Sarapu, Associate Professor of Political Science, Public Administration at Tallinn University of Technology, to go over the theoretical framework or analytical framework of the book. Kuli, the floor is yours.
Thank you. The concluding discussion yesterday, the panel discussion that we had, I think that it actually made a perfect introduction to the issues that we are discussing today, because we had extremely interesting presentations during the day, discussing European migration crisis from different perspectives. And in the concluding discussion, we arrived back to the issue of state size. So very small states in this picture, where does the size come in? And as Vitaut was asking, what is it that we are studying, and what is it that we are trying to say? Do we try to explain something, or what is it? That's not my presentation. That's Marilis, I think, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm happy to present an analytical framework for the book. This is a co-authored chapter, a cooperation exercise between me, Anders Vivel, and Baldur Thoraldsson. So when I finished, then Baldur and Anders can say what else is there to be added, or what I got wrong. So as we saw yesterday, the phenomenon or the problem that we are discussing and studying here, it's extremely multidimensional. There are many layers to that. There are several governance levels engaged. We can approach it from very different perspectives, from historical perspective, from political science perspective, from international relations perspective, from administrative perspective. So what it means is that we have actually many possibilities where we can anchor our analysis. It's not straightforward, and depending on the focus, we can focus more on the small states aspects of the problem or issue. We can focus more on the fact that it was a European migration crisis. Also, that Baldur brought up in the conclusion of the day, that maybe we underestimate the extent that it was a European crisis, and what are the implications of this crisis, and what are the results of the changes that have happened on national levels. There is a possibility to focus on migration, how it relates to migration flows, the push and pull factors. Then we can approach it more from the perspective of crisis, something that is challenging the existing institutions, the existing values, existing routines. And then there are challenges and responses. What were the challenges, or what were the responses? So for this book and for this analytical exercise within our Jean Monnet project, the analytical starting points and frameworks that we propose focus on small states anti-crisis, meaning that we are interested in the size of states, how it interacts with other variables in the process. And we want to understand how small states responded to the European migration crisis as crisis. And as Anders very nicely put it when we were writing the introductory chapter, what we want to provide is an analytical anchor, not a theoretical straitjacket. Because the partners in the project come from very different disciplinary backgrounds. The crisis as such, as we learned yesterday, actually it manifested in very diverse ways or different ways in different member states. And the meaning of crisis, what was the crisis, is actually different depending on the geographical position of the states, their historical background, their experience with migration flows. So it means that actually the crisis as such, or the migration crisis as such, manifested differently, and we are focusing on crisis. How small states dealt with crisis, something that was threatening, challenging, questioning the existing institutions, questioning the existing decision-making routines, questioning the existing solutions. And from that perspective, our aim is perhaps more explorative, not so much giving certain explanations or building models, but more exploring and trying to understand. And what we see is that, and that is, of course, a perfect rationale for our project. And the book is that although we know already quite a lot on small states, there is not too much analysis on how small states exactly cope with crisis from a comprehensive perspective, trying to open different aspects of that. And on the other hand, surprisingly, there is actually not yet done a lot academically on the European migration crisis, as surprising as it is. And there is even less that we know about what happened on the level of member states, how they reacted, what were the challenges. So there are many good reasons to undertake this book. I believe that we can make a considerable and substantial contribution to the discussion. And what are the analytical starting points that we can use to address the European migration crisis from the perspective of crisis, not so much maybe migration, but crisis, how it challenged the small states in the EU. And for that, for the first thing, we, of course, again, have to ask, what are small states? As anybody who is working on small states knows that every discussion, every publication basically starts with a question, what are we talking about? What are small states? So what are small states, and what do we know about their strategies in dealing with crisis? So for the first question, what are small states? Respecting the analytical multidisciplinarity or the multidimensionality of the European migration crisis. The aim of our analytical framework is not to tell you one specific definition, what is a small state. Rather, what we do is that we provide different perspectives on what is a small state. And we see that there are basically 5 types of definitions or 5 perspectives of saying or understanding what is a small state, because we can define small states from very different perspectives and in different ways. And all those 5 perspectives or 5 definitions of small states, they all tell us something important about small states, how we can understand small states, their constraints and their opportunities. And we see that basically those 5 perspectives of saying what is a small state, they focus on power, that small states tend to be small powers. They tend to be rule takers, not rule makers. Secondly, that they have limited capabilities, and that we can address from absolute perspective or from more relative perspective. From absolute perspective, it is usually the small population that is the most important absolute criterion or variable that we can use to say what is a small state. It's a small state with small population, and it has considerable implications for how the states are functioning. From more relative perspective, there are other criteria that we can use. For example, relatively small compared to other countries in terms of economic characteristics and economic capabilities or power. Then we can address smallness through understanding the context where the small states are operating, trying to see how the context is supporting or constraining them and helping them to be larger or smaller. For example, in terms of institutional rules, it matters a lot how the decision-making rules, for example, have institutionalized on international level and how it either restricts states, small states, or how it supports them. And last but not least, we see that there is actually a very big role for perceptions, how the states are perceived, how they perceive themselves, and as the Minister of Justice was saying yesterday, it's up to the states to decide whether they want to be larger or smaller, and they can be larger in certain spheres, building on their strengths. So what we learn from five of those characteristics is that there are or five of those definitions, that there are certain characteristics about small states, that small states tend to be ones with smaller power, they are rule takers, they have more limited capabilities, they are more dependent on the context, and there is a big room for perceptions in defining smallness and also understanding how small states function. So we want to understand how small states, as states with those characteristics, how they reacted to the crisis, how they cope with it, how the crisis challenged their existing institutions, decision-making systems, and how they cope with it, both in terms of external strategies oriented at international level and internal strategies or domestic strategies oriented at addressing the crisis at home. And that is the second, or that is actually the key part of our analytical framework. Writing out or outlining what do we know now about the strategies that small states are using to deal with crisis, to cope with crisis. What are the strategies, how they try to make themselves more resilient? Because we know, and we also saw from the discussion on the definitions of small states, that small states tend to be more vulnerable. They are more vulnerable to the events in international level, and also more vulnerable to the events that take place at home. So we can outline two types of strategies, or think in terms of two types of strategies: the external strategies, oriented at international level. And there is, of course, a lot of discussion on that historically from the perspective of small state security. What are the strategies of small states in terms of security, historically more from the perspective of military security, but increasingly more also societal and economic. And we see that more and more there is the reason to talk about small states hedging, and that comes or is related usually to the small states seeking shelter. That is the key conceptualization for understanding how small states cope through external strategies outlined by Baldur, or the work of Baldur, and that helps us to understand the external strategies. And we see that small states seek political, economic, and also military shelter in order to avoid or prevent crises, but also to cope with crisis. And that crisis, on the other hand, shelter seeking may make it easier to cope with the crisis, but also at the time of crisis it may be more difficult when small states have less to offer, perhaps, on the international level themselves. And we also see that the shelter does not come without the price, and usually it becomes manifest in more limited autonomy, and also, as we are probably going to see and also learned yesterday, for example, in the case of European migration crisis, often a very complicated choice between international cooperation and political expectations and discussions at home, where you have a trade-off. And secondly, domestic strategies. This is something that is perhaps discussed less systematically in small states literature, as the discussion on small states in international arena has much longer traditions and much more academic discussion than the political administrative characteristics of small states, how their administrative systems function, and especially what we see is that there is a less academic or generalized knowledge on small states that comes from studies of small developed, economically successful states, because there is much more that have been learned from studying small island states and small developing states. So this is something where again we can make a considerable contribution. And we see that from the perspective of domestic strategies, again we can look more at the political decision-making, how political decisions are made. And here, the main strategy of small states comes out that helps them to cope with the turbulence and to be more successful is democratic corporatism. That was outlined by Katzenstein, that is the most famous and key text on small states, saying that the decision-making structure where both the interests of employers and employees are also engaged in the decision-making, and this inclusive way of decision-making has been one of the key success factors of smaller European states. On the other hand, we see also that domestic administrative structures and the administrative system differs in small states, and there are some specific characteristics that are especially characteristics for the small states, and these relate to prioritization, multifunctionality, the more informal way of operating, and much bigger role for individuals and individual leadership than in large states. And these are characteristics that help small states to cope more flexibly with turbulent situations, with crises. And interestingly, what we see is that actually those small state characteristics that relate to more flexible, more informal, more personalized decision-making very much overlap with the characteristics that characterize, or the traits that characterize successful crisis decision-making processes. So, which means that we can hypothesize or say that those specific characteristics of small states make, the way that the decisions are made, make small states more resilient towards crisis. But of course, again, there is always a trade-off. So, which means that more informal structures, more personalized structures, more multifunctional structures have the other side of the coin in terms of less expertise, less room for specialization, more possibilities for for information being lost, more higher impact of personal conflicts and other traits like that. So these are the key things that we outline in the analytical chapter for the book that we hope that create as a framework to address and to understand the impact of the European migration crisis and the strategies that our small states have been using to cope with the European migration crisis. And from that perspective, we explore the function of size of states, and we want to understand how the size of states and the small size of states as an important factor, how it interacted with other factors, and what we can learn from that. And I understand Anders will provide us with the first possible conclusions, what we can generalize out of the studies that we have done this far. So, thank you. Questions or comments, reflection on the framework or the tools in general? Whatever comes up in your mind, in Christmas.
And also, maybe I should just add to that if you have any questions or comments, also you're most welcome to send them to us also, so that we can kind of try to incorporate them in the chat process too. So.
You send all the critical comments by email.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think that we can have a shared discussion, and Anders and Baldur, of course, very welcome to interfere. But I think that this is the case where we have a multidimensional dependent variable. And as said, we have a common starting point and analytical starting points for understanding how the European migration crisis impacted small states, how they cope with them. But as the manifestation of crisis was different in small states, so it means that also our dependent variable will differ, and also I think that we have a value in that we do not say to our authors of the chapters in the book that they have to have a specific dependent variable, but that there is a leeway to focus on key issues relating to the specific cases coming from specific countries or regions, and also that we respect the multidisciplinarity that we have in the book, because that would also affect how we define our dependent variable. So maybe not.
Yeah,
something.
Just to add to that, I think what's perhaps most interesting is not so much kind of whether it's more or less cooperation that small states seek or cope, but more how they cope. So it's more kind of identifying the landscape of coping strategies and coping approaches, and try to find patterns in that.
Yeah, I think it also gets back to the question whether we try to explain something or we try to explore something. And this analytical exercise is probably more about exploring.
From Greece. Could you hear me?
Yeah, it's fine.
It's okay? Yes. You mentioned that during crisis, provided by larger states. I'm not sure if always this is the case. Generally, yes. But sometimes small states, during crisis, they use other strategies, for example, leakage politics, linking the migration issue with other issues, pressing especially the larger member states in order to satisfy other demands. So we have to be sure and to see thoroughly what we're talking about and for which state we're talking about and which period of time we're talking about. And so I think we need to have much more comparative analysis between different states to try to point out something principles that we have put as a theoretical assumption. So I'll explain later on during my presentation what I mean examining the Greek case, especially in the first 6 months of 2001 refugee crisis. So I will be a little bit reserved about such theoretical assumptions. We have to prove this is always this is the case, and I'm afraid it is not. From research, which at least I have done for the Greek case.
I'm sure that Baldur perhaps wants to comment on that, but it was not only states but also international organizations. And the responses and strategies that we outline in the analytical framework, these are possible strategies. It doesn't mean that the small states always have to do that, but this is what we know now about their strategies. And from that perspective, this is one of probably the key outcomes also of this book, that we will learn more about the strategies, how they function, what has been used.
So, exactly what you're saying is the reason why we don't provide a strict analytical framework for all the cases of the book. We have a number of theoretical frameworks which authors can choose from, depending on the cases and how they small states, the small states responded to this situation, crisis situation. Before that was important. And so I'm looking very much forward to hear what Anders has to say at the end of the day on exactly, on the theoretical lessons. We can learn from these different cases, because as we know, these small states responded differently to the crisis situation.
Yeah, on that same note, I actually agree with you a lot. Because I was thinking, you mentioned in the introduction part that you want to provide a menu, theoretical menu. And I was thinking that your menu is not really rich, because you had for the foreign policy, you mentioned the hiding, and then you say it's not relevant anymore because after the Second World War. But I think with Roderick's presentation yesterday, it came out that it could be relevant again. And I think that you could have put maybe more discussion on that. And then it's on basically the shelter theory, and I was also thinking, like, how does it link to, for example, what Jana found out, that unilateral action is actually one of the strategies that the states take instead. And also with the public administration theory, you mentioned a lot of positive things about the small states being resilient thanks to the informal and personal ties, but there's also the negative impacts of that. And I think you should add this to the chapter. You know, with few people having too much power, I think we see it in Estonia, and especially now with the rising populism, I think it's a really good question to bring up. What will be the downside of the small state having this strategy of placing their domestic politics on only a few people that are involved, and if their politics doesn't really go together with bigger politics. But can I just continue on that with another comment I had? I was also, I think you did a really great job now in the presentation to highlight this cross-disciplinary ambition of the book, and you mentioned it once in the beginning as well, that the book has this ambition to be cross-disciplinary. But I think in the chapter itself you have to stress it a bit more, because that also brings me to my second question. introduction, I was thinking like, well, what's the really difference between, you have the 5 criteria for the definitions, and the second one has the size of population, and it's the absolute capacity you mentioned. But it's linked to the military size then and the economic size. And then the third one is the size of population and the economy and all this together. Why are you having those two different, why are you distinguishing between them then? Because it seems that we're talking about the same thing. We still have the size of population that is really important. And now when you present it, I realized that it must be because of all the different disciplines that are involved, and for them, for different disciplines, it must be important that, size of population perhaps is more relevant in political economy. I don't know. Guessing that. But I think in the chapter itself, I didn't see many differences between the second definition and the third definition, because it has the same issues or the same variables. It has the size of population. Yes, in one place it's more stressed, but in the other one it's still the same. The outcome is still the same. Because of the size of population, we have lesser military personnel and also economic power. And then third, I was thinking also, that comes back to yesterday's question, that why is the size important? And Anders, you had really good answers to it. And you should add that to the chapter. And I was thinking, because Olaf Knudsen already in 1996 wrote about this, that there's no difference in how the states act. He was talking about security though, but still how they act, because it's all about power disparity. It's all about the geographical location, which we yesterday learned is really important in this crisis. And also this cycle of politics right now. Who are your neighbors? What are the relationships with your neighbors? And I think this kind of discussion would benefit the chapter as well, just to show that you're aware of the criticism of the scholars who long ago perhaps said that this size is not that important. Anders is really thinking now.
Just a quick reply to the size issue. Yes, I think we can agree that the number of inhabitants is probably always going to be the most important variable in defining the size of states. However, perception is as well an important thing. When it comes to linking number of inhabitants to the size of the market and military capacity, of course it depends on the number of inhabitants. But still, I think it makes a difference whether you have a strong, small domestic market or a weak, small domestic market. For example, if you, a state like Greece, dealing with a crisis situation like the migration crisis, after an economic downturn, a weak, small domestic market, if you compare it to, let's say Austria, dealing with the same crisis situation. If it's, yes, small domestic market, but still a strong economy. So I think it's important to draw out the economy part, if I can say so. And then as well, you can't have states, small states like Iceland, it doesn't have a military. And then small states that have somewhat strong military compared to the size, proportionally. So I think that's why we are mentioning these variables, these traditional variables. And but then, what we are hoping for in providing this variety of theoretical framework is for our cases to come up with something new. Maybe indicate administrative weaknesses of small states, how the flexibility and informality of how things are done in small public administration may have helped out or may have caused some great difficulties. So hopefully that will come out of the analysis.
Hopefully.
Sorry?
Hopefully.
Yeah. Very slow.
My name is Apis. I'm a PhD student at the University of Iceland. I wasn't yesterday because my flight was cancelled, so I'm reading up something now my main question, since we're talking about the framework and the strategy of all this, and the definition of the words that we are talking about and all that, the question that comes to my mind, especially when I think about Iceland, is actually it's about the word migration crisis. Because as we were pointing out, it depends on what you're talking about, both in time and in place, whether it's actually, it's kind of like it's assumed what we mean when we are talking about the migration crisis. But I think it was actually, and is, the situation is very different between both countries in Europe and in time. So what I think about is it at the beginning of this discussion defined what exactly we are talking about? For example, both with the word migration, what migration are we talking about? And what do we mean by crisis? Because honestly, for example, in my opinion, I've been working with asylum seekers in Iceland since 2009. If we didn't have the news from Greece, from Europe, I haven't seen a crisis here. It hasn't been what I think normally could constitute a crisis. But it's part of course, it's part of a bigger picture, and of course I know what we are talking about. My question is basically related to whether it is defined in this discussion, and whether it is framed before we start talking about how small states react to it. That would be my question.
Yeah, a lot of questions. I also will respond a bit to Jana. Yeah, that is a conscious choice in outlining this analytical framework, that we will not go too deep in the European migration crisis. Of course, we describe it in a compact way, but the focus is more on the aspect of not so much migration crisis, but crisis. So migration crisis. That was definitely a very critical, challenging juncture for the EU as a whole, and it had different manifestations in different member states. So we do not have a common definition for crisis for the member states because it manifested differently. Also, the other questions that come out of the discussion, yeah, I think that this is a very good reflection on the choices that you have to make in building an analytical framework for a study like that, or for a project like that we are doing. And with regard to the definitions, what we outline are different perspectives, and those different perspectives lead to different definitions. And why it is important? Because the way you define something leads your further analysis, because your definition is defining also then how you see the problems. And from that perspective, the absolute capabilities and relative capabilities lead to different definitions and different framing of problems. So from that perspective, I would say that it's important that those different perspectives are there, because we are not saying what is the theoretical perspective for our book, but we leave that up to the authors. And the other thing that I conclude from the discussion is that in the analytical framework right now, the choice is to take the knowledge that small states are more vulnerable. This is a common knowledge that small states are more vulnerable. This is not usually challenged. So we say that small states are more vulnerable, they tend to be more reactive in their strategies. But I understand, or I conclude from the feedback, that we should also outline more of those vulnerabilities, because now what we have done is that we know that they are more vulnerable and we focus on coping strategies. But I gather from the feedback that there is a more wish for also outlining the vulnerabilities that they are exactly, and how they perhaps become manifest in external sphere and in domestic sphere. So that's.
Any more short comments before we move on to the cases? Of course, we will continue these discussions, of course, today.
Thank you.
Really good. Thanks for good questions and comments. And we will, as I said before, we will continue our discussions at least to noon. Now I would like to introduce Eva Maria Hlynsdóttir, a colleague of mine and ours, associate professor at our faculty at the University of Iceland. She's going to chair the next session on the cases that I spoke about earlier. Eva Maria, please.
Yes, thank you, Walter. So we're going to go into the few cases now, with the 3 cases, and we're just going to go straight through them, and then we're going to have a coffee break, and after that there's going to be a panel. So we're going to take the discussions after the introductions of the cases. And the first presenter that I would like to introduce is Primož Pevčin, from associate professor at the University of Ljubljana. And his topic is on coping with migration crisis in small states of the EU, the experience of Slovenia. Please.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction. Dealing with the first case study, the country that was heavily involved into the migration crisis of 2015 and 16. This migration crisis is actually still going on, and we might refer it to as the first peak. Eventually we will see what the things are going on, but still migrations via the Western Balkan route are actually still active. So maybe just to outline some things about this presentation. Actually, what we need to and what we refer to, according to the theoretical framework that we received, is about explaining actually what were the coping strategies of specific countries that were, let's say, under effect of the migration crisis. So basically, it's always a nexus. Is it explanatory or exploratory, this kind of a study? In particularly because in this case of the migration crisis, the context and the phenomenon cannot be clearly distinguished. So is there, were the countries actually involved and guilty for not correctly responding to the crisis, or vice versa with this slightly little bit context? So just to refer to this issue at the beginning. So maybe just to refer a little bit to see some pictures about what actually happened going on. These are very famous pictures. Actually, they were broadcasted all over Europe. What happened on this Western Balkan route, which was one of the 8 main active migration routes to Europe. And actually, if we refer to a little bit of data, during the 2015-2016, actually there were 2.4 million asylum claims in the EU member states. And during the period 2015 to 2018, there were approximately 2.5 million illegal boarding crossings detected. Now, this means illegal and detected. We do not know how many were not detected. So, as Hugo yesterday referred to, it's still, if we assume that it's 1 person detected, 1 undetected, then we might get some rough estimate on the data. And this Western Balkan route actually was maybe a little bit of a side effect of the Operation Sophia. It was one of the operations during the 2015 year when actually they wanted to break down these smuggler routes via the Mediterranean. And then a little bit this migration route shifted towards the east through Turkey, and then it went to Western Balkan and then to the destination countries of Western Europe, like Germany, the Benelux countries or the Nordic countries that were actually targeted. What was the specifics actually of this migration wave? It's about scale, how actually this migration wave occurred. It was maybe, people were basically walking through. And first of all, they entered actually the Schengen zone in Greece. They exited the Schengen zone and then re-entered the Schengen zone at first through Hungary and then through Slovenia. And this actually created some very interesting issues within this migration flow, because initially the migration flow went through, Greece, Northern Macedonia, Serbia, Hungary, and then to the Western Europe. But then the Hungary, closed the border with the fences, and this migration wave actually went through the west, through Croatia, and then to Slovenia, and then to Austria. About 500,000 people, solely for this western part of the route, entered to the Schengen zone. In total, I think the data was around 800,000. So approximately 300,000 through Hungary, approximately 500,000 through Slovenia. Basically, Slovenia is a country that is at Schengen point, so Schengen entry point to the EU, and it's a rather small state. And we will see later on that actually here the state size was very crucial factor. The capacity, you are bordering, so you are representing an external border to the Schengen zone, and at the same time you are a small state and you are facing 500,000 people basically walking through your country in 6 months period with the population of 2 million. So you can see that it's a very, very heavily challenged. The problem was that this migration was not managed. We have managed and unmanaged migrations. This was not managed migration. Actually, in some extent, it was not anticipated. This was clearly affected upon the politics of the central government. At first, they say, well, we are not affected. The migration wave goes through Hungary, it will remain the same. But later on, when the Hungary shut down the border, actually in Vivar, on the route, now we should start, with the planning. The government produced some planning, and it was highly irrelevant because the contingency plan that was done, classical crisis management response, you have a contingency plan. They said, what we will do with asylum seekers? But there were practically no asylum seekers because the migrants were simply wanted to go to the destination country, and we were simply geographically there that people would like to walk through. So when the government actually realized what is happening on, then these bilateral actions started, At first, the countries involved, like Croatia, Austria, and at least from our concern, from our perspective, didn't realize that they need actually bilateral action. So to effectively transfer people through to the destination country. So if they cooperate, they would be much more effective in this manner. Now, maybe some practical experience, actually. What was also specific? As Marilis has already indicated, was this migration crisis or refugee crisis? When we entered the street level officials, so the policemen who actually were at the Schengen border zone, there would be an issue that was maybe not so portrayed in the public, but actually who entered. The majority of migrants didn't have any documents with them. So if you go to the street level, the most common answer, when were you born, was January 1st, 1995. So in case, maybe in a decade or two, if the Eurostat statistics, let's say, would say the vast majority of European citizens was born on January 1st, this is maybe the consequence out of it. So that's a little bit biased, Not that the majority, but if the bias is on January 1st, this might actually go through this perspective. So there are several contextual factors that created how the government actually coped with the migration flow. First was anticipation, and this crisis was not anticipated. Slovenia has, even in modern times, very large experience with dealing with anticipated migrations and anticipated refugee flows. Starting from the 1991, immediately after we became independent, actually we got the first migration wave starting with the war in Croatia. 25,000 people actually went to Slovenia, but they returned by Christmas already because let's say the war in Croatia settled a little bit down. But then 1992 came and 1993 with the war in Bosnia, and we received 70,000 migrants who actually, the majority of them, permanently stayed. At first, we organized separate schools for them, given the fact that we were in crisis. This was early 1990, this transition period was actually only starting. We received 70,000 refugees who stayed there. At first, they had their own schools, but later on, when we discovered that actually they will stay here, then we put them in our classical schools. But with this case, we didn't anticipate anything. We didn't even anticipate, let's say the government didn't anticipate that what will happen. Will they stay or will they go? And contingency planning was, what should we do with the asylum seekers? Later on, it's irrelevant. We should be very effective. And what is actually the problem was that there was asylum shopping, as already referred to yesterday by Germany, And when these transit countries realized that actually people wanted to go to Germany or to the Nordic countries, okay, we have two options. Either, either we start to deal with according to international responsibilities and, we start obeying Schengen, Dublin, etc., or should we wave them through? And the policy, coping policy was actually we should wave them through. And what is this specific? This wave, this 6 months period were specific that national governments of the transit countries were the ones who actually dealt with the transportation of the migrants. Not the smugglers are otherwise doing this job. But here, the national governments of the countries involved were actually dealing with transportation. People coming to the border, changing the trains, going with the trains to the next border, again changing the trains. This actually happened. And this was maybe the proposition that whatever happened, that we were capable of transporting so many people around this route. So maybe just to see, maybe I would not go into detail. There were a lot of internal quarrels what to do because European level basically at first said, okay, you can do whatever you can do. Then in 2017, the European Court of Justice says, well, this was not a good policy that you did in 2015. They challenged at first the idea of the European Commission. Nevertheless, what actually was, there were a lot of internal quarrels about, central government said, okay, we should be very effective, but the municipalities, should take responsibility. And a lot of land was, doing for this. And the ultimate outcome was that policy making was layered and decoupled. So actions were not entirely actually aligned to each other. And what was the outcome? If you, let's say, scrutinize the figures of the Eurobarometer and other polling agencies that, let's say, measure the confidence in the central government, in Slovenia, what happened? The confidence in the central government actually decreased substantially just because of the migration crisis. We had economic boom during this period, from 2014 to 2019. We still have economic boom after the financial crisis. Nevertheless, the decrease in the central government was enormous because it was obvious that it was not coping with the strategy and was not able to cope, let's say, and to give some evidence what actually is needed, what the subnational government should do. Just maybe to see, these are some figures, how actually, some pictures, how actually it happened. This is the southern Slovenian border, so the entry point to Schengen zone. There was accommodation centers, so people were, checked some necessary healthcare, and this is how the train came to the Austrian border, Yeah, the train, etc. And it was a huge logistical issue, country of 2 million needed to transport. We do not have so many trains and buses, to accommodate. And regular passenger traffic during this period was problematic, The trains were used for the transportation, not for the regular people, coming to jobs, etc. Even the buses, etc. So this was one the strategy. At first, the European Commission actually approved this kind of action, but after 2 years, European Court of Justice overturned this decision. So we will see what will be the effect out of it. Maybe just to see some potential outcomes. Here, what we see with the coping strategy, the size of the country was very important, let's say, independent variable, if we would say. How the country actually responded, So, given the limited capacity, the actions were different than if there would be a larger country. So we can treat it within this case, since we do not have a very strict theoretical framework, more as an independent variable affecting, the strategy with this. So it's not something that would be detected. I would not go into detail that European migration policy, how should it be re-centralized again, even if there are no possibilities that it's aligned according to all members, because we have different preferences on this. Some countries are only transit countries, some are, destination countries, so they might have larger benefits out of it. Nevertheless, what is here the coping strategy? We still have, you are the country that is the EU and Schengen zone member, and at the same time, here it was quite evident that national interest also needed to be followed. And, EU interest and the national interest was not the same regarding this migration crisis. This was peculiarity because, it was raised to the bottom at the end. So actually an EU problem that was raised down to become a national member state problem. And this might be some issue with it. So what is the outcome of this crisis? Well, this is Slovenian-Croatian border, and we have a nice fence there because we built this fence. It was not to close the border, but to to route the migrants to the entry point so that they not go through unchecked messages. And this is a picture from this year. The migrations are still happening, but there are smugglers doing this kind of it. From the street level, let's say evidence, sometimes some cars are stolen and then accident came and, these are the migrants. Some accidents might occur, and so a lot of people are finding. So we found actually this, a lot of this evidence that people are still, passing through. Because, as Jana referred to yesterday, from the Bosnian camp of Vučjak to Slovenian border, it's only 30 kilometers. So you can walk, basically, through. It's one-day walk, actually, if you're fit, You can do it in one day. And this is what was the outcome. Actually, it's the Kolpa River or Kupa River, as you say, and it's very beautiful river to swim. But, these days we have a nice fence there, so you are not able to swim there anymore unless you have keys, because there are some, doors through this fence for the farmers that utilize the land. So this would be maybe the outcome of all the efforts that we tend to have. Okay, I think, yeah, it's enough. Okay, so thank you. We will collect the answers afterward. Yeah, okay, then I'm finished.
Yes, thank you, Primoz. The next presentation is on small administration facing a complex policy challenge, Estonia and 2015 refugee crisis in Europe. And the presenter is Marilis Trey from the Tallinn University of Technology.
So, thank you. Good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and present this chapter today. And I would also like to remind you or highlight that today is Friday the 13th. So when I mess up something, it's not my fault, it's Friday the 13th. But yes, so our chapter that was written together with Gülli Sarapuu focuses very much on the administrative perspective and the governance of a complex policy problem like migration and the refugee crisis was. So the main rationale for the chapter is that migration is a wicked problem. It is horizontal, spans across borders, it's constantly evolving, it's persistent, it involves multiple stakeholders who might frame the problem very differently. So kind of addressing these wicked problems or complex challenges requires also combined effort, but also possible changes in the structural system and innovative ways to collaborate to kind of address these challenges. And the responses very often depend on also the institutional structure, the culture of the country, and also the kind of institutionalized processes and the context. So it's very much context related. And as we know, small states have their own set of these kind of characteristics that kind of give them certain constraints and opportunities when dealing with these very complex policy problems. So the questions that we address are what are these opportunities and constraints for small countries, and also how did the small state context of Estonia influence the kind of governance of the refugee crisis during 2015. So a bit about the background. It's important to say that, first of all, Estonia is a small state by almost all of the definitions, so a small state par excellence. And what's important to highlight for the context and the culture and the administrative structure of Estonia is that it's a very young state. It regained independence in 1991 and had to kind of rebuild its political administrative structure from scratch. And another important aspect that relates directly to immigration is that during the Soviet occupation, we had very large streams of forced labor coming into Estonia, which very much changed the ethnical composition of Estonia. So before the Second World War, we had almost 95% of Estonians of the total population, and after in 1991 it was around 70%. So the composition of or the volume of foreigners living in Estonia was much higher, which makes immigration issues very sensitive, especially for a country that just regained independence. And if we look at the asylum policy, that was totally absent during the Soviet times. There was no asylum policy for the Soviet Union, so that was another kind of policy field that Estonia had to build from scratch. And we can see kind of these four important junctures during the development of the asylum policy in Estonia. So the first one is 1997. When Estonia kind of established its formal asylum policy. So before 1997, all asylum seekers that actually did reach the borders of Estonia were considered as illegal immigrants. They were detained, and often negotiations with neighboring Nordic countries were conducted, so the Nordic countries would take them because they already have established asylum systems. But because of the carrot and stick kind of approach of the Nordic countries, they very much were interested that the bordering Baltic states that had a Russian neighbor had formal systems, and they negotiated that or kind of set requirements of visa agreements with the Baltic states in return to establish a very formal structure and join the international asylum regime. So that was one of the very important incentives to create the formal asylum policy. So in 1997, Estonia ratified the international conventions related to refugees and also adopted the Refugee Act on Refugees. That was the most important legal document then. And with it also there was a certain division of responsibility. So very quickly from this table you see the most important actors on the Estonian asylum policy field. So the international level, we have the large international organizations who have the mandate to look after asylum seekers. And on the national level, the Ministry of Interior is the main actor who's in charge of proceeding all the asylum applications. And then the Ministry of Social Affairs, who is in charge of support services and integration services, but also other ministries like Education and Research, of Culture, Ministry of Justice, and also the local governments where refugees then end up living. And an important part is left to the civil society, so the third sector, who are the main service providers for the target group. So the next juncture came with Estonia joining the EU. So a requirement to join the EU was to adapt the acquis. So by that time already, the European Union had a common European asylum system, or the beginning of it, at least. So Estonia had to adapt all the directives on this policy field into the domestic legislation. So a lot of new regulations were adopted. And then a very important part here is also the access to European refugee funds, because before that there was actually no investment or kind of no priority to develop better reception infrastructure or better services, because there just lack of resource for that. So the refugee fund actually gave a possibility to increase the quality. In 2009, another juncture. We can see from the total number of asylum applications presented and the positive decisions made that from 2009 there was a leap if you compare to 2008. And since then, kind of steady increase. So, but you can see also that the numbers are still very low. But this, nevertheless, kind of brought the issue of refugees and asylum seekers to the public debate and the public agenda. And also the NGOs and the international organizations kind of gained ground and started to maybe highlight the negative parts of the asylum system in Estonia. So if we can kind of conclude the asylum policy development until the migration crisis, we can see it was a policy field with very low priority. There were very few asylum seekers, so naturally you didn't really need to deal with the policy field. And it was because Estonia also was mainly a transit country for the Nordic states, so not a destination country. So very often things were taken case by case. It was a very tailor-made system because of the low number of asylum seekers, and also the issue of immigration in general, but also asylum seekers and refugees in particular. It was very securitized, and also there was a very conservative stance. So the minimum was always done. But you can, as I already heard, so kind of this indicates that the next very important juncture that has really changed the development of the system came with the refugee crisis. So for Estonia, it was still a very novel challenge because of the very low level of experience dealing with refugees. And the issue of asylum seekers and refugees kind of just quickly went into flames. It was a very salient issue. It was on all the public debates. Society, everybody was talking about it. And during the summer of 2015, there were also the conservative right wing kind of really used this issue to gain popularity. So there were anti-migration demonstrations, there were racist social media pages created, so it was very quickly spread very widely. And there were also a few incidents. So in in the early fall of 2015, actually someone then put the refugee reception center on fire. There were no damages. It was only aesthetical damages, but still a very kind of hateful act. And also in the other picture, you can see the demonstrations against refugees. So it was very widespread and kind of laid on the anxiety and the fear of the society. And one of the reasons for that was that during the summer there was a lack of kind of clear communication from the government. It was very much wishy-washy, and there was no clear communication line. So the people left to kind of debate on and use their information from maybe coming from the conservative right wing. So the negative public opinion was very widespread. You can see here that the government kind of tried to create a common information room for local governments, for example, who had to deal with the refugees coming in, but these were very much kind of indoors, very focused on a few target groups, not wider in the society. And there's a very kind of sarcastic picture here of two ministers. So a summer theater with Sakna and Befkur. So Sakna was the Minister of Social Affairs and Befkur the Minister of Interior. So, and they actually had a tour of Estonia for 2 weeks when they went to and talked with all the local government representatives, explaining the situation and what the kind of aim was. And you can see from the picture it's perceived something as we try to give you a very beautiful picture, and then everybody, all people with different skin color kind of hold hands and dance, and the sun is shining and everything is really fine. But that was not believable because there was no clear strategy, and the messages coming from the government in the kind of wider society was very mixed. So it was a very kind of a lack of clear communication. And as a result, so the widespread opinion was very negative. So even even though the numbers were very low of refugees arriving here, then the perception of the threat was very huge. So at one point, it was even said that refugees are a bigger threat than Russia, which for Estonian is a big thing. So in the fall, eventually, Estonia agreed to accept refugees through the migration scheme proposed by the European Commission. So there were long and careful considerations, deliberations both on the national level but also on the European Union level, so debating how many people we will be able to accept and accommodate. And we agreed to accept 570 people, and you can see from the table here that the actual number of people arriving to Estonia was much smaller, and to this day a lot of them who arrived to Estonia kind of have already left towards other countries. So what did it actually mean on the practical level of receiving these resettled or relocated people? If you look at the number of refugees, then throughout the whole, since 1997, then the 570 people we agreed to accept was much bigger than the total number of people we had received before that. So it required adapting the kind of regular system. So we had the basic structure of proceeding the applications and receiving and kind of support services for the refugees. But there was a decision to review all the files of the asylum seekers on the spot. So actually we had to send out proceeding officials to Greece, Italy and Turkey to conduct or review the files on the spot to make the decision of granting a refugee status or not on the spot, which required another kind of regulation and standards and resources. And there also, there was no systemic experience of receiving refugee children and providing and integrating into the education system. So that required gaining new capacities. Also, lack of suitable accommodation, lack of specialists like translators or doctors who could speak other languages and deal with the people with a vulnerable background. And also the limited, the target group that we had received before was very limited in terms of numbers, so kind of increasing the resources and increasing the capacity to provide the services. Some of the headlines from the news. So what the proceeding then was, then Estonia first kind of mapped the possible capabilities that they had at the time, mapped their opportunities, and then kind of see what additional activities and resources were needed. A very important part, it was a sudden and very rapid increase of coordination and cooperation. So as I mentioned already, the tour of the two ministers around the Estonian local governments. There was a formal committee of asylum policy involving all the important public sector stakeholders, or the agencies, ministries, and also a creation of a social partners group which also involved the most important public sector stakeholders, but also all the non-governmental service providers, but also also international organizations who have a very widespread group of people involved in the asylum system. And the main burden of kind of developing a strategy of how to actually receive then the relocated and resettled refugees fell on the shoulders of a very few experts who had been dealing with asylum seekers in their work before. There's an example of a lady who had been dealing with refugee things for since 2000, so almost 20 years. And you can see here that it was a half-time job for her because the number of asylum seekers was so low that it was only half of her job, basically. But they were the kind of the key individuals who kind of were very central during the crisis times. And another important thing is that there was a very constant exchange of information. So the Ministry of Interior very much made a conscious decision to be very open and involve all the stakeholders. So it was a very kind of combined information room. Yes, that I already said. So when we kind of analyzed the Estonian case, then we use two kind of theoretical frames or the dilemmas that come out from small states. So three from Baldacchino and Anders himself, and also four from that deal with the governance. So I'm not going to read these, but these were the kind of the points that we were focused. And what the Estonian case then shows that the crisis in Estonia actually was not a practical crisis. It was only a crisis of the head, or a crisis of values and solidarity, mental crisis, but never a crisis in terms of practical reasons. All the administrative challenges were addressed very quickly, mobilizing the key people, the resources, kind of going in head on. There was a kind of a team spirit among all the social partners and the government officials to get this, to solve the challenges ahead. And what was very much highlighted is that it was a big learning experience for Estonia, and that new competencies were created. The asylum policy field became more institutionalized, and they were more focused now on kind of guaranteeing sustainability of maybe possible future mass immigration of people. But of course, there are also a negative side. So the system was very much dependent on very few people, and there were lack of very kind of this niche experts and vulnerability in terms of personal leaving. And also lack of critical mass of the target group hindered the ability to kind of provide the quality level of services. Yes, so thank you for your attention, and waiting for your questions after the break.
Yes, thank you, Marilis. As we are running a little bit late, we've decided to take a very short coffee break right now, maybe by just 5 minutes. You can bring the coffee in. There are some cookies outside as well. And then we're going to continue with the last presentation and then go straight into the panel. So.